I have this theory: don't apply. Just, across the board, don't apply, because when you're sat in the hiring seat, what you're seeing is an overwhelming amount of candidates coming through who seem to just sometimes, quite honestly, ignore whatever the criteria is. Don't apply. Build your network. Stay in constant contact with people and try and be as predictive as you can about when they might need help. If a young person came in and managed to somehow work out the 5 things about my daily job that they could take away from my tasks, I would happily find some way of hiring them. You have to create ways to reach them. So when it came to the pandemic, I just actually lent on a lot of those things. How could we be smarter? How could we use what was happening to our advantage? You have to be razor sharp on what you're looking for, but also, in a weird way, you also have to be quite flexible, because somebody could walk through the door you hadn't expected.
We're diving into the fascinating world of brand marketing and cultural anthropology with Rob Scotland, a true innovator at the intersection of culture, technology and human behaviour. From decoding modern audiences for global powerhouses like Adidas and Nike to leading brand communications at VO Technologies, Rob's journey is a masterclass in crafting brand stories that resonate. We'll explore how his unique blend of anthropological insight and marketing expertise shapes winning strategies in today's rapidly evolving digital landscape, in a conversation that bridges the gap between cultural understanding and creative excellence in the ever-changing world of brand communication. So Rob, welcome to the pod. How are you?
I'm pretty good, especially after that intro. I really like it. It's great.
Yeah, it's good. I mean, I had to say I can't even say it now.
Yeah.
Anthropology a few
That's
times,
right.
and I was quite pleased I managed to get through that. But anyway,
No, you didn't. You put an ology on anything, and I think it makes you sound infinitely smarter than I probably am.
Well, we'll get into it. Let's have a look. Let's start with the same question that we ask every guest. So let's start with your story. What are your experiences of hiring and being hired, and what are your lessons learned?
It's a real mix, actually, because I'm 48 years old now. I live in Copenhagen, Denmark. I moved for love and work, but I've owned my own company. I have my own imprint for 9 years. I've worked with a multinational organization in Pandora Jewelry. I've worked for some of the biggest independent and most successful ad agencies in the world as well. And now I'm back with a sports tech company. So I think I've pretty much experienced, in my field anyway, the majority of the hiring.
It's pretty diverse.
Yeah, the ability to be hired or hire. So some of the key things, I think, is that the pandemic's changed things a lot. I will come back to that, but I think there's a red thread. There's also a real issue around a real glut of kind of talent that's out there at all levels right now as well. But I think it still comes back to having a decent gut instinct about who you're speaking to, or how you're trying to portray yourself, and just being more strategic than ever, I think, is a real key from that perspective.
Yeah, I think as you said, from the pandemic element, there's a lot of stuff we can touch on there. But one of the ones I wanted to just dive into very quickly there is, you mentioned there's a glut of talent. There's a huge amount of candidates on the market at the moment. News came out this morning that job vacancies have gone down again. Certainly in the UK, I think US is similar as well.
Right.
What do you see the challenges are for anyone at any level, really, kind of trying to really break into, right, I need a job. How am I getting that? What are you seeing from your side as well?
I have a very controversial take, because I teach a couple of classes, one to professionals and another to kind of younger full-time students, and I have this theory: don't apply. Just, across the board, don't apply, because when you're sat in the hiring seat, what you're seeing is an overwhelming amount of candidates coming through who seem to just sometimes, quite honestly, ignore whatever the criteria is. I'm lucky, or it's a double-edged sword. I work in kind of marketing communications, so the issue is it's quite still an attractive industry and category to work in. So you put a junior title forward and people with 10 years experience will kind of be answering. So for me, it's all about building, maintaining and kind of fostering a network. It's about being as predictive as possible. My last 5 roles weren't ever, the job description wasn't ever put forward until we actually had a conversation about the role. There's some legal bits which obviously you have to, advertise the role legally and those types of things. But more and more, I think the role of hiring or being hired is risky, and we're living in a time when it affects the hiring manager as much as the person being hired. So that means I think you have to just alter your strategy as much as possible. If you're trying to get a role, honestly, it makes you feel good to sit down and bang through 4 or 5 applications in a morning. You're just going to be in a pile with hundreds, if not thousands, of other people. There's a job role in my organization right now. 3,000 people have applied for a graphic designer role. It's a nightmare for the people team. I don't know what the hiring manager is going to do when they have to kind of narrow it down. So we're living in a really, really interesting time as far as that's concerned. But don't apply. Build your network, stay in constant contact with people, and try and be as predictive as you can about when they might need help, which is really key.
I think it's definitely a slightly contrarian view in terms of, certainly from a junior perspective. I think once you get to mid to senior level, you can be more comfortable with that because you've already built that network, because you're expecting that either tap on the shoulder or just part of a conversation. Let's have a talk about this. I think from a junior level, it is much more difficult to do that. But I think I agree with you to some degree. But I think actually what people need to do more is, personal opinion, is just do the work rather, because I think you're right. Instead of banging out 4 or 5 applications in the morning, actually, how much thought are you putting into those applications? Correct. And actually, I'll get your opinion on this as well. But I think with LinkedIn, it's very easy just to apply and not really think about the role. Yes. And actually, if you take a step back and you go, is this role right for me? Can I do the job? Even if you don't tick all the boxes of the job description, even if you think this might be a bit of a stretch, if you can demonstrate that you think you can do that role, then you've done the work. You can form an opinion on some of the stuff that they've done. You've understood who's hiring. The organisation, etc., etc. And I think that side of things, I think as a junior person coming into work or getting their first or second role, saying don't apply can be pretty scary.
I have a plan for that though. so and honestly, I think of the things I wish somebody told me when I was 21, 22, trying to get into the industry. I think the key thing you can do is the same message. Build a network. You're a junior, except you're entering the workforce. The biggest, and it's the term I still use now, how can I help? How can I help?
Yeah.
Honestly, and if you identify, and I'm giving away all the trade secrets on this one, but I mean, if you identify 5 people per day, let's start with 5 organizations. Cool organizations you like to work for, the best brands in the world. Okay, great. Within there, identify 5 people. Identify who's the people or the talent acquisition person or the people manager or HR. You do that 5 times a week. It's 25 people. That's 100 people in a month. If 10% of those get back to you, you've got 10 new contacts. That's not a bad hit rate. Yeah. On top of that, what you should be identifying when I say about getting predictive, there's aspects of my job. I'm head of brand and communications at a sports tech firm. If a young person came in and managed to somehow work out the 5 things about my daily job that they could take away from my tasks, I would happily find some way of hiring them. So being as helpful and as useful as possible, I think when you're entering the workforce is really, really key. I do unfortunately come up against a lot of young people who are maybe a little bit too entitled now. It's partially because of education and expectations, but honestly, just a little bit of humility, a little bit of an ability to say, look, how can I help? What can I do? It might not be what you want to do, but you can get in. I think that's really key. I was really inspired by somebody I know who they started off as an assistant, as a PA to a graphic designer who ended up, and that graphic designer ended up becoming the design director at Levi's, then ended up becoming the global director of brand at Nike. And this guy followed all the way, ended up doing his design courses in the evening and that kind of stuff, and now is a global design director at Adidas. So Takes a little bit of time, takes a little bit of hard work. But if you're young, I think there's a bunch of hacks you can do. If you're young, you got all the stuff us old lot don't have. You have time, energy, maybe some fresh approaches. Listen, I've even done it. I remember when we had our own firm, we found a friend who was a photographer. We got him to give us the rights to one of his images. We printed off, I think, 10. And we hand delivered them. We got some IKEA frames, and we hand delivered them to different offices. We got 3 projects out of the 10. You know, one of the guys, he didn't even keep it. He gave it to his PA, but he was like, that was really cool. So a little bit of innovation, a little bit of thinking the right way. Now you're going to do that, or you're going to rely only on a really well-crafted, Chat GPT sponsored CV and letter. I know which one I will go for.
We can get into AI later, but no, I think it's a really interesting approach. The flip side of it, do you think that organisations are doing enough to foster almost a talent acquisition pipeline, so that instead of having to go, Christ, I've got 3,000 applicants here, actually go, we've got 10 people that we already know that we want for this job?
Ideally, I mean, I think the role for the people teams or the HR teams or talent acquisition, I think it's not easy, because they also have to try and be as predictive as possible. In a perfect world, it would be the same rules. You've got your eye on a few people. There's obviously a pipeline of young people. For instance, if we just stick on the juniors, the kind of student kind of acquisition piece is really, really important. The intern kind of paid internship role is also really, really important if you use it strategically, because you have your next set of hires right there, which is really, really cool. And again, it works from both sides. It's just trying to get as comfortable and as familiar as possible with whatever the organization is. From a talent acquisition perspective, I don't see it enough in the category I work in. Sometimes it's just sheer workload, because you have to do everything from, find somebody in finance to IT to marketing to management. But as much as possible, LinkedIn is a really good tool for that as well. Just knowing who's doing something interesting out there, who's exciting, who's on your radar. Having a radar alone, I think, is really, really important.
I think that's, I agree. I think certainly within sport, there are certain organisations that do it really, really well. But there are organisations that just rely on those CVs, and I've had it before, where you do get you're like 300, 400, 500 applicants, and you think, how am I, without using AI, how am I whittling these down? And it is so challenging. And flip side to that, from a applicant perspective, it's how am I standing out? And there's loads of different things that you can do that I think, again, it's thinking differently if you are going to apply. I want to go back to something you mentioned, and let's tackle it now. Pandemic wise, huge change in practically everything. You were in Denmark when the pandemic hit as well.
I was in Denmark, but I was running a global strategy team that worked in London. Most of them I still haven't met. Because I got the job and then the pandemic happened like literally the week after. So for 2 years, we tried our best to kind of run a major strategic team at one of the biggest ad agencies in the world. It was interesting. It's very, 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 very different.
I found I was at Harlequins during it, and actually, because it was the way it was, and with rugby actually kind of coming back into the fold before lockdown finished and all those different types of things, that we still saw each other quite a lot. How did you find the talent management side of stuff? You said you led the team. How did you find actually kind of making sure that, especially in a creative industry which needs human interaction a lot more than necessarily sat in front of a spreadsheet, being completely, not being harsh to people who sit in front of spreadsheets, but how did you kind of manage that process?
No, but I think that's where the anthropology kicks in, because I think you've got a lot of people who are really good at doing something, but they may not have emotional intelligence, or again, that ability to potentially get quite predictive about what's happening. So what was interesting about the pandemic, from a majority of people that were working from home, who were lucky enough to work from home, because you kind of had a two-tier system. You had people who could work from home, people delivering to people who were working from home. but you had the opportunity to see into people's homes, for instance. So you could kind of see that you got a young person and literally their bed is in the background.
Yeah.
Okay, come on, that's not like ideal from that kind of scenario. Or you've got the ability to really look into people's eyes, because the screen is quite telling in that kind of way as well. So you really need to employ a lot more emotional intelligence and a lot more of a communication where people really think you give a damn. Yes, you have to get the job done and that kind of stuff, but there's also things you could do, and we tried all sorts of different ways around it. Most of them didn't work, but when it did, I think what is really interesting is you develop quite an intense digital kind of relationship with people, and I think that is born off the fact that you actually try your best. Some things you actually over exaggerate when you're on screen, for instance. There's some things you just can't replicate at all, but I think once people knew that you cared, genuinely cared, which again isn't always being taught in management and leadership schools, then that helps. I think sport is one of the key things still. I mean, I'm a former I think I was a NFL Europe trialist for about 5 seconds. I remember they looked at me for about 5 seconds. But I played amateur American football. I've coached the majority of my life as well. I think there's something about those sports, especially sports like rugby, American football, those more collision kind of sports, when you have to get American football's like up to 60 people or a squad of people to do something which is mostly going to hurt. You have to create ways to reach them. So when it came to the pandemic, I just actually lent on a lot of those things. How could we be smarter? How could we use what was happening to our advantage? Small things like you could script a meeting. You could script a pitch and those types of things you couldn't really do if you were in a room, which is excellent. So I still use quite a few of those things actually, and it was quite fun to see in the UK, because the UK is so conventional that it kind of really struggled with like what? No office. It's like no, we can see into the CEO's home as well as the intern's home as well.
The panic sets in when you're like,
it's hilarious.
I've got to tidy up behind me now.
Or people with like 1 million books. My first question was, have you read all the books?
Just a background. That's what it was.
Exactly,
you mentioned as well around the entitlement element of certainly people coming into the workplace now. Do you think the pandemic had an effect on that? Do you think, I mean, it was a hugely transformational time for everybody, but even more so if you're going through A-levels or university. Do you think that now there is a bit of, whether it's entitlement or laziness, that has stemmed from that? And I suppose, how do we try and counter that if we're from an organisation or from a higher perspective?
I think it's. I mean, my daughter actually, she's now 25, so she was just exiting kind of a really key period of her education. On a personal level, I think it affected that group. So maybe those 2-3 years, I still don't know if we're going to fully understand what's happened to that particular group. The groups before and after, relatively unaffected, because they weren't going through that critical time of their career. What was interesting is a lot of people I know who were effortlessly digital, just leveraged everything to their own advantage. So they were able to not behave in a geographically limiting manner. So I know people who set up their own businesses who managed to work across like all countries, which is crazy. And now they're living in different countries because of that. So some people, because they grew up around digital tools and means, it didn't really matter that much. Other people I know diversified really, really well. And then others who maybe had a much more conventional kind of approach to their education, their life, struggled quite a lot, because all of a sudden all those pillars that they had before, okay, well, I go to this school, I do these things, kind of got absolutely torn apart. From a recruitment perspective, what was really interesting was it blew the doors wide open in certain industries. Tech industry, for instance, it meant, okay, well, now I'm not restricted about where I can hire from. Educationally was the same thing. Universities could pick up, talent wherever they really wanted to. So I think we're in the early days of really understanding. I mean, those kids would have been 21, 22. We won't know maybe for another 5-6 years. But I definitely feel that group deeply affected that group, and it accelerated, I think, some necessary changes that were already happening, but it just moved them on a lot faster.
Yeah, and I think you mentioned earlier around the element of care as well, and I think that's one of the things that has really accelerated. And I think we're still very guilty, and a lot of senior management leaders are still very guilty of not having that element. And there's this 24/7 hustle culture, etc., that doesn't suit everybody, and each to their own. And it's about finding that right person for that right role. You mentioned as well around your gut instinct when you're hiring, and the emotional intelligence that comes into that. But what is it when you are in an interview, or when you found somebody, tap on the shoulder, whatever that might be, that you're like, I want this person in? What is it that you are looking for within that interview process? What are you trying to really kind of find from them?
And I've had to learn from mistakes as well. My format now is very much, and I learned this quite a lot from working with people who work in the NFL, American football, where you have a very transparent, upfront kind of conversation. It's a bit like signing a contract between you. You say, look, I'll do this. I need this from you. Can you help me achieve this? And then, okay, let's go. Then we'll do it together, which is great. Ironically, really interestingly, the kind of tap on the shoulder candidates, they've been losing out over the last 2-3 years for me to other candidates who've come out the woodwork and blown me away. But I think when you have that very transparent upfront conversation, then what it allows you to do is return to that if it doesn't work. And I've had that really recently, where I went with a gut instinct pick because it answered all the problems I thought it would at that particular time. And unfortunately, that person just couldn't evolve as needed. And what was good about the upfront conversation is I was able to talk about things in a very strategic and formal manner to say, listen, it's the role. I don't think you can handle this role right now. You've given it your best shout. We love you as a person, but remember we talked about we needed this, and this, and right now it's not happening, and you know it's not happening. We've had conversations. So that makes it a hell of a lot easier. In my past, I've tended to feel like sometimes, as the person going for the role, people are overperforming, so then it ends up over-indexing on the extroverts. Yeah. And same thing, the role is then sold in some way what it actually isn't, which I think is a real challenge as well. So I think somewhere in there, I've kind of managed to get to a nice kind of sweet spot where I feel fairly confident about talking about what are the pros and the cons and the challenges, and where do I need help? Why am I hiring for this role? And what I'm looking for from the candidate is that back. And I try and do the same thing. And whenever I've applied for a role, I've tended to be as again, I think you're right in terms of, as you get a little more experienced, I think you get a little more strategic. So you think, right, I need this role to do this for me, and I'm happy to trade these things in order to make that happen. Perfectly fine.
Yeah. Do you think then that the traditional interview process is broken?
100%. Big time.
Because it's hiring and looking for a job is a buyer-seller relationship. Everyone's selling themselves, and ultimately an interview is how can you sell yourself in the best way. Correct. Have you experienced, or have you got any thoughts on what that potential new thing could be? I mean, you spoke about paid internships and those types of things. Is there like a middle ground of, well, actually, we need you to do a bit of work for us in order for us to go and take the risk on you effectively? Because you mentioned again at the very outset, we're in a risk-averse environment at the moment with everything else that's going on. Yep. And so how can employers mitigate that risk in some way without ultimately putting the employee or the person going for the job in a bad situation where you're out of a job within 3 months because you didn't fit the organisation or didn't fit the role? Yeah,
I think, and it changes from industry to industry. I think in the kind of marketing communications industry, freelancing and project work is a lot more prevalent. Yeah. What I like about that is it allows you to see exactly how somebody would work. But I mean, again, I think the problem with the current way is it leads you down biases. So my bias was I was automatically attracted to somebody's energy if they were super extrovert and you can really come across really well. So that, means you can get some charlatans as well. And I think of one candidate in particular, and she was brilliant. I couldn't see it because she was nervous. English was a second language. She didn't really perform that well in the phone interviews, and the risk was also that this would be a relocation for this young person as well. And I just felt like I didn't want to have that accountability of those things. And my business partner at times was like, no, I see something. Don't know what it is, but I see something. Let's go for it. So we went for it, and to this day, she's still, I think, 15 years later, probably one of the best hires I ever had, and just absolutely blossomed. But we wouldn't have been able to tell from the conventional kind of evaluation metrics. Where possible, what I try and do as much as possible is that project. So maybe we come in, again, we're transparent, we'll pay a fair rate, but and these are the metrics through which we're going through. And then I kind of have an off the cuff or kind of informal conversation to say, hey, smash this. Once you're in, smash this and show that you are critical to everything going forward. You're a key part of what's happening, and again, you're making several lives easier. It's that NFL thing I've got still, of where you kind of, if you can play in the NFL, if you can play one position, then you better be outstanding at that one position. Rugby's probably the same, but if you can play three positions and you can place kick and you can do fantastic, great, then you're eminently more employable, which is key.
I always come back to this word value, and that for me is, every time I speak to a candidate, no matter how senior, it is about how much value you can add to an organisation and understanding what that is. And actually, I spoke to somebody last week, and they sent across their CV, but what they sent across as well was a one-pager, and it was, these are the three areas that I can add value in, and this is why.
Fantastic.
And the thought process, and again, it comes back to this hard work and actually putting in the work before you do it, but the thought process behind it was unbelievable, because you are just like, this is the value that I can add, and it's so black and white. And obviously it's not in real life, of course, but being able to articulate that is a real skill, and I think it's something that not everybody can or has really thought about. You mentioned as well around the bias side of stuff, and there's a huge, and we kind of touched on it earlier, so let's delve into it quickly. The AI piece.
Yes.
Lots of different things coming out around how to mitigate bias through AI. AI is inherently biased, and we know that, and how do we mitigate that side of things? But I also, that you've got applicant tracking systems from organisations that filter on keywords that are in job descriptions. You then have candidates putting in applications that are also written by a ChatGPT or another that make sure that they include those keywords. I've heard stories of people putting them in text boxes in white in the background of their CV so that it still gets picked up by the applicant tracking system but isn't on the CV itself. My personal view is that we're just going to get to a point where it's all going to cancel each other out. We're going to go back to the human approach, proper human approach.
Yes.
But again, it comes back to, I think the interview process is broken. I think the application, the whole thing is broken in terms of that CV. What's the best use of it now? That's a big question.
No,
is there a use of it? And I suppose, how can we get the most out of it without getting to a point where we're just fighting against each other?
Yeah, I think it's a tool, just like anything else. It's the internet on steroids. But what I'm really lucky, so I work for a company that's basically founded on AI. Yeah. But AI is inherently dumb, so it requires a lot of input. So what a lot of people are thinking is happening is they're basically amalgamating. It's a lot of blancmange. It's just this beige kind of stuff that's coming out. So I think if you're not using it, you're missing out. If you're not training your own GTP to kind of to think about what it is, how you write, your turn of phrase, those types of things, I think you're doing yourself a disservice. But at the end of the day, you're still going to have to get into a room potentially or on a call and convince somebody that you're the right person. And then those first 3 months, you need to really do that mix of kind of watching, learning, evaluating, assessing, your stakeholders and delivering. So as long as it helps you deliver and over deliver, perfect, fine. I mean, I've got a friend who was pretty dyslexic, and he hired somebody to write all of his university work for him whilst he did the artwork. The guy's doing pretty well right now. So smarts are smarts, and if you can use any of these tools in a smart way to make yourself stand out, make yourself eminently employable, fantastic.
Augment rather than replace,
Big time.
because it's the way that I look at it, and look, I use it as much as the next person, but it is about using it in the right way.
Big time. No, but it's one that I'm not afraid of it by any means, but I do think I can tell when something's been written, that way. But I can understand, again, it's just the way things feel right now. I can understand why people are feeling relatively desperate. I know people who've been consistently getting to second and third interviews and not getting a role. So it's tough right now.
It is tough, and again, it comes back to the wider environment and less people leaving jobs because of security, or at least looking for jobs whilst they're still in roles. And there's so many different elements that are really affecting job seekers, but also affecting organisations that can't find the right candidate, or have got people that are 10, 15 years too experienced.
Yes.
And you then got that person who's 10, 15 years too experienced going, I can do this job, I just need a job. And it's a really difficult kind of balancing act, really. But that does lead us on, and we've flown through the time here, Rob. It's been a fantastic conversation, but that does lead us on to the final question of the podcast. There's two pieces of advice here. What are the one that you would give to those looking for roles, and the second piece is those looking for the best talent for their organisation? From your experience, what should they do?
It goes back to what we talked about, I think, at the very beginning. If you are looking for a role, one, do as much homework as you can on the not just the organisation, but the person. Two, try and get as predictive as possible about how they could possibly use you and leverage you. And three, be helpful, be useful and helpful as much as you can. For those looking for talent, I think the key thing right now is there is a lot of people out there. I think you have to be razor sharp on what you're looking for, but also in a weird way, you also have to be quite flexible, because somebody could walk through the door you hadn't expected. So having your radar on as much as possible is key, and somehow in this sea of CVs and stuff like that, try and be as flexible and as focused as you can.
Yeah, I love that, and it's a perfect way to end. Look, Rob, thanks for coming all the way from Denmark for this.
Thank you.
I'll claim it's for this podcast and not for all the other stuff that you've got going on.
100% for this, but blame James Kirkham.
But no, good luck with you've got a launch in 3 hours. 2 or 3 hours now.
It's fun. No, but it's been great fun. Thank you so much.
Thanks for coming on. Appreciate it.
Nice one. Cheers.
Well, hopefully you'll agree that's another brilliant conversation. So thanks again to Rob for coming on the podcast. There's loads of different things that we can take home from there. Conversation went in so many different directions, but I think some really, really good tips for everyone that is either looking for a job or looking to hire and to manage their teams in a really effective and efficient way. So really, really good podcast. If you liked it, as always, subscribe, comment. It all makes a big difference to try and get this to as many people as possible and to help them on their journey. So really good guests coming up. Really excited for some of the episodes coming up over the next few weeks. So looking forward to seeing you on the next podcast.